My name is Tori Thatcher. I am 32 years old, and for most of my life I was the extra chair my family never bothered to set out. Before I tell you how I took everything back, please like and subscribe if this story resonates with you. I say that now with the steadiness I earned the hard way. There was a time I would have apologized for the way my voice shook. I would have softened my words, edited my memories, arranged my grief into something more convenient for other people to hold. But I have learned that my history does not require anyone's permission to be true. For years, my family treated harmony like a fragile heirloom, something that could crack if anyone spoke too loudly, asked the wrong question, or dared to name the obvious. My sister Victoria was the protected centerpiece of that heirloom. My mother polished her. My father hovered around her like a man assigned to guard a candle from wind. And I, apparently, was the draft. The allocation of love in our house was never explained aloud, but it was executed with patriarchal precision. The golden child received indulgence, the quiet spouse maintained the illusion, the scapegoat absorbed whatever discomfort threatened to surface. My mother called it keeping the peace. My father called it not making things worse. Victoria called it not starting drama. They all meant the same thing: Tori, behave as if you do not need anything. I can still picture the kitchen where my mother did most of her verdicts. White cabinets that had yellowed at the edges, a clock that clicked too loudly, a bowl of fruit she refilled obsessively as if abundance could be staged. My mother was the kind of woman who liked her counters clear and her stories cleaner. In her world, feelings were spills. She wiped them up quickly. Growing up, I learned to be useful, because usefulness was the closest thing to affection I could reliably obtain. I folded laundry with military corners. I cleaned the baseboards without being asked. I watched Victoria's toddlers during family gatherings so my sister could rest, which meant she could sit with her phone and receive compliments for how exhausted motherhood had made her. I smiled in photographs even when I had been chastised in the car on the way there, because my mother believed sadness was a kind of vanity. "Stop making everything about yourself," she would say, not when I demanded the spotlight, but when I requested basic recognition. The phrase lived in her mouth like a reflex, smooth and practiced. My father was not cruel. That was the complication. He was gentle in the ways that required no courage. He brought home my favorite cookies when he remembered. He patted my shoulder if he caught me crying in the hallway. But when the moment arrived to choose between truth and comfort, he always chose comfort, the family's comfort, not mine. In our home, Victoria's needs were presented as inevitabilities. Mine were presented as inconveniences. When Victoria failed a calculus test in high school, my mother sat with her for hours at the dining room table, rubbing her back, making tea, calling her sweetheart. When I got accepted into college with a scholarship, my mother said, "That's nice," without looking up from her phone, as if I'd announced a sale at the grocery store. When Victoria got pregnant the first time, the entire family reorganized around her belly like it was a new religion. Holidays became too stressful for her, which meant they were rearranged to her preference. Conversations became too upsetting, which meant no one was allowed to question her decisions. If she cried, it was a crisis. If I cried, it was an attitude problem. Even as an adult, I remained the designated absorber of discomfort. I lived in Boston by then, in a studio apartment that smelled faintly of old radiator heat and the cinnamon candles I lit to make it feel less temporary. I freelanced as a graphic designer, which my family described with the tone that implied it was a hobby I would abandon once I got serious about life. Victoria lived in Connecticut, close to my parents, close enough to borrow their time the way some people borrow money, without repayment, without shame. She had a husband with a decent job, a growing family, and the kind of confidence that comes from always being forgiven. And yet, despite everything, I still bought a plane ticket home for Thanksgiving. That's the part I say now with the faintest disbelief. I can't blame my younger self for wanting it. Hope is not stupidity. Hope is a survival instinct. When you've been trained to believe love is something you earn, you keep auditioning. You keep showing up. You keep arriving with gifts and good manners and carefully arranged cheer, as if one day your effort will finally be met with equal effort. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I was standing in my studio apartment with my suitcase half packed and a pumpkin candle burning on the windowsill. Snow had begun falling in soft, distracted flakes outside the glass, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it is. I had already printed my boarding pass. I had already sent Victoria a neutral text, "Can't wait to see everyone," because neutral was the only safe language in our family. When my phone rang and my mother's name appeared, my first instinct was relief. She's calling. She's reaching out. Maybe this year will be different. I answered with a warmth I did not feel. "Hey, Mom." There was no warmth on the other end. Her voice was flat, controlled, as if she were reading a policy memo. "Tori," she said, and the way she said my name already contained an ending. "I need to tell you something." My body recognized danger before my mind did. My stomach tightened. My fingers curled around the phone. "What's wrong? Is Dad okay?" "Your father's fine." A pause, brief but deliberate. "Listen. I've been thinking, and don't come home this year." I actually laughed. It wasn't humor, it was shock trying to disguise itself. "What do you mean, don't come home?" "Victoria doesn't want drama." The words were so familiar they almost sounded rehearsed. My mother spoke them with the confidence of a judge citing precedent. I blinked at the half-zipped suitcase on my bed. "Drama? I haven't even talked to Victoria in months." "Exactly," my mother said, and her voice sharpened. "And let's keep it that way." Something cold slid down my spine. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I was coming for Thanksgiving." "Victoria is pregnant again," my mother continued, as if my plans were irrelevant background noise. "She doesn't need stress." I could hear the unspoken instruction beneath it. "You are the stress." My lips parted, and for a moment I could only breathe. The apartment felt smaller, as if the walls had moved in to listen. "Stress," I repeated softly. "Because I'm there?" "Because you ask questions," my mother said, and now there was irritation, the kind a person feels when they're forced to acknowledge a mess they'd rather ignore. "You know how you get." The phrase landed like a slap, not because it was loud, but because it was dismissive. It framed me as a known problem, a predictable inconvenience, an unstable element they had to manage. "How I get?" My voice cracked in a way I hated. I steadied it. "Mom, last year one asked Victoria why I wasn't invited to her baby shower." "That's not getting any kind of way. That's a question." "See?" My mother snapped. "That's exactly what I mean. You always make everything about you." Outside, a gust of wind pushed snow against the window in a sudden smear. The radiator hissed like an exhausted animal. I stood very still, because in my family, stillness was the only posture that didn't offend. "I already bought my ticket," I said, careful, as if each word might detonate something. "Then get a refund," my mother replied immediately. No hesitation. No apology. As if my money, my planning, my anticipation were minor clerical errors. "Victoria is pregnant. She doesn't need stress. You understand?" It wasn't a question. It was a command disguised as moral instruction. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. My fingers began to ache. "Mom. I'm your daughter." A pause. Not a soft pause. A cold one. "Then, Tori," she said again, and in that single syllable was a warning. "Do not make me feel guilty." And then the line went dead. She hung up. Not dramatically. Not with a slam. With the clean efficiency of someone ending a call she considered concluded. I stared at my phone. The screen was already dimming. My reflection hovered faintly over it, pale and motionless. For a few seconds I didn't move, because movement would make it real. In that silence, the betrayal did not arrive as a sudden explosion. It arrived like weather, unavoidable, enveloping, and indifferent to my protest. My suitcase sat on the bed, half full, like a joke with no punchline. My boarding pass lay on the kitchen counter beside a small grocery list I'd written for things I planned to bring home. Cranberry sauce. A little gift for the kids. Candles, because my mother always pretended to like the ones I bought. The cruelty of it was not only that I was uninvited. It was that I was uninvited with moral certainty, as if excluding me was a virtuous act. As if my absence was a form of care for someone else. I sank onto the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped beneath me. The candle's scent suddenly felt nauseating, sweet in a way that had no right to be sweet. Then, as if my mind were sorting through evidence, memories began to file in. My 16th birthday, when my mother promised cake and bowling, then canceled because Victoria had failed an exam and needed support. My college graduation, when my parents arrived 2 hours late because Victoria had a prenatal appointment that couldn't be moved. Christmas mornings when Victoria opened piles of gifts while my mother explained that my present was a little delayed this year, as if my desire for equal consideration were a childish impatience. So many moments, strung together, forming a pattern so consistent it could have been stitched. I had always been the acceptable sacrifice. The realization didn't make me cry at first. It made me hollow. There is a kind of grief that does not wail. It simply sits down inside you, heavy and quiet, and refuses to leave. Still, I did what I always did when my mother delivered a verdict. I tried to negotiate it with my father. My fingers moved on their own, dialing his number. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times, 4. When he answered, his voice was cautious, already defensive. "Hey, kiddo." He already knew. "Dad," I said. "Did Mom tell you?" A pause. I could hear the television in the background, football, probably. Something about the casual noise behind him made my throat tighten. "She mentioned it," he said. "And you're okay with it?" My voice was soft, but it carried a sharpness I didn't bother to hide. "You think it's normal for your daughter to be told not to come home for Thanksgiving?" Another pause, longer this time, as if he were searching for the correct phrasing to avoid responsibility. "You know how your mother is," he said finally. "She's just trying to keep the peace by excluding me." I didn't say it as a question. I said it as a fact. "Dad, I haven't even fought with anyone. I haven't raised my voice. I just exist, and that's somehow too much." "It's not like that," he insisted, but his tone was thin. "Then what is it like?" I asked. I pictured him in his recliner, shoulders slumped, remote in hand, a man who had spent decades surviving by refusing to intervene. "Tell me, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're all choosing Victoria over me again." Silence. A thick, cowardly silence. "Dad," I said, and I hated the quiet plea creeping into my voice. "Do you want me there?" 5 seconds. 10. Then he cleared his throat. I think it's better if you listen to your mother this year." Something in me settled. Not rage. Not despair. A finality. It was the sound of a door closing from the inside. "Okay," I said, and the word came out calm, almost polite. "Okay, Dad." "Tori, don't be," he began, but he didn't finish the sentence. He never did. He always started objections like that, as if he might stop a fall, and then stepped aside to let you hit the ground. I said okay, I repeated. "Happy Thanksgiving." I hung up before he could offer another excuse dressed as concern. He did not call back. That night, I sat in my apartment watching the snow thicken outside my window. Streetlights turned the flakes into pale glitter, deceptively beautiful. The city looked peaceful from above, as if nothing cruel ever happened within it. I thought of my family in Connecticut, preparing their table. I pictured my mother smoothing napkins, arranging place settings, ensuring symmetry. I imagined Victoria being offered the best chair without even noticing. And I realized something I had been avoiding for years: the table had never been built for me. The next morning I woke to the muffled sound of my neighbor's family arriving upstairs, footsteps, laughter. A child squealing with delight. The smell of roasting turkey drifted through the vents, warm and confident. I made instant coffee and drank it by the window, watching the street below. My phone remained silent. No apology from my mother. No text from my sister. Not even a perfunctory happy Thanksgiving from my father. Around noon, I made the mistake of opening social media. Victoria had posted a photograph. All of them around the dining table: my parents, Victoria, her husband, their little boy in a tiny turkey sweater. everyone smiling as if the world had always been kind to them. The caption read, "So grateful for my family." I zoomed in, counting the place settings. 4 adults. 1 toddler. 5 chairs. There was no empty chair. No symbolic space left for the daughter they had excluded. They hadn't simply uninvited me. They had erased me. I closed the app and sat there, the coffee cooling in my hands, the apartment quiet except for the radiator's intermittent hiss. There are betrayals that scream. There are betrayals that whisper. This one did neither. It simply behaved as if I didn't exist. And that, perhaps, was the worst part. I stood up, put on my coat, and looked at myself in the mirror by the door. My eyes were swollen but steady. My hair was pulled back. My face looked older than it had 3 days earlier. I had a thought so simple it felt almost radical. If I'm going to be alone, I will not be humiliated by it. I left the apartment and stepped into the cold. Snow bit at my cheeks. The wind tugged at my coat. The city smelled like wet pavement and exhaust and distant bread ovens. I walked with no plan except refusal. Eventually I found a restaurant still open on Thanksgiving, Harborview Grill, a place with dark wood paneling and brass fixtures, the kind of establishment that made loneliness feel particularly conspicuous because everything about it suggested celebration. Inside, warmth wrapped around me. The scent of roasted turkey, butter, and fresh bread hit me like a memory I didn't have. Everywhere, families. 3 generations at one table. Couples leaning close. Children waving crayons like flags. People belonging to each other without effort. The hostess glanced at me with the soft pity reserved for the solitary on holidays. "Just one tonight?" "Yes," I said. My voice didn't shake. She led me to a small 2-top squeeze near the kitchen door and beside a large family whose laughter filled the air like music. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and stared at the menu as if I were studying for an exam. I told myself I would eat. I told myself I would be fine. But as the minutes passed and the family beside me passed dishes back and forth, interrupting each other affectionately, arguing about football with familiar irritation, something in my chest began to split. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to let the pain seep out. My turkey arrived, golden and perfect, cranberry sauce bright on the plate like a small wound. I took a bite. I couldn't taste it. My throat tightened. Tears rose without my consent. I turned toward the window, pressing my napkin to my eyes, trying to make myself small the way I always had. And that was when a woman's voice, warm, composed, cut through my practiced invisibility. "Honey," she said gently. "Are you all right?" I looked up, startled. The older woman from the family beside me was standing there, her silver hair neatly styled, her eyes kind but not naive. She looked at me the way my mother never had, as if my feelings were information, not inconvenience. "I'm fine," I said automatically, "just allergies." Her mouth curved in something between a smile and a knowing look. "Allergies don't usually make someone cry into their napkin on Thanksgiving," she replied. I let out a small sound that was half laugh, half surrender. "That obvious?" "Only to someone paying attention," she said. "My name is Eleanor." I swallowed. "Tori." "Well, Tori," Eleanor said, glancing briefly back at her table, "no one should eat alone today. Come join us." I shook my head at once, panic rising. "Oh no, I couldn't. I don't want to intrude." "You're not intruding," she said, calm and certain. "I'm inviting you. There's a difference." From the table, an older man looked over and raised his hand in a cheerful wave, as if I were a late arrival they'd been expecting. "She won't take no for an answer," he called, smiling. "Trust me." A younger man, around my age, leaned back in his chair and grinned at me like this was the easiest thing in the world. "She really won't," he said. I stared at my untouched plate, my small corner table, the napkin still damp in my hand. Then I looked at Eleanor's steady eyes. Something inside me, something exhausted from begging, made a decision. "Okay," I heard myself say. "If you're sure." "I'm sure," Eleanor replied. and she placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. I stood up on slightly unsteady legs. I followed her toward the table. And I did not yet know that this small act of kindness, this quiet invitation, was the first hinge in the door that would eventually close on my old family forever. They made room for me as if I had always belonged there. That may sound like a sentimental exaggeration, but it isn't. No one fussed. No one performed generosity. A chair was pulled back. A place setting appeared. Someone slid a basket of warm rolls toward me without asking whether I wanted one, the way families do when they assume your presence is permanent, not provisional. "I'm Richard," the older man said, standing to shake my hand with a firmness that felt grounding. "This is my wife, Eleanor. Our son Daniel and his wife Sarah. These are the kids, Emma and Lucas. And this one," he added, gesturing to the younger man who had smiled at me earlier, "is Marcus." Marcus lifted his glass in a small salute. "Welcome to the chaos." There was no interrogation. No awkward silence demanding that I justify myself. Someone asked what I did for work, and when I said I was a freelance graphic designer, Sarah responded with genuine interest instead of polite dismissal. Daniel passed me the mashed potatoes without hesitation. Eleanor refilled my wine before I realized my glass was empty. The children argued cheerfully about who got the last crescent roll. Richard told a terrible joke involving a turkey and a computer. Eleanor groaned. The kids laughed anyway. And I found myself laughing too. Not the careful, abbreviated laugh I had perfected around my own family. A real one. The kind that surprises you with its volume. As the evening wore on, the tightness in my chest loosened, then dissolved altogether. I ate. I drank wine. I spoke without pre-editing my sentences for danger. No one corrected my tone. No one flinched when I expressed an opinion. When the check arrived, I reached for my wallet instinctively. Richard waved it away with a gesture so casual it felt intimate. "Our treat," he said. "We always pay for new friends." "I can't," I began. "You can," Eleanor said gently. "And you will." There was no condescension in it. Just certainty. As we gathered our coats near the door, Eleanor pressed a small cream-colored card into my hand. Her name. Her phone number. Her address. "If you ever need to talk," she said quietly, so only I could hear, "call me." I nodded, unable to articulate what that simple offer meant to someone who had been taught not to need anything. Outside, the snow had thickened, muffling the city into something softer. I stood there for a moment watching the Morrisons, Richard adjusting Eleanor's scarf, Daniel corralling sleepy children, Marcus lingering just long enough to make sure I didn't feel rushed. I had walked into Harborview Grill as an unwanted daughter. I walked out having been seen. I didn't attend Sunday dinner the following week, or the week after that. The invitation felt generous to the point of being unreal, and I didn't trust myself not to break it by wanting too much. But Eleanor called. "Just checking in," she said, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. No interrogation. No guilt. Just presence. By December, I finally accepted. The Morrison house in Brookline looked like something from a memory I wished were mine. A Victorian with a wraparound porch, warm light spilling from every window, the faint scent of something baking even before the door opened. Eleanor hugged me the moment she saw me, not tightly, not theatrically, just enough to say, "You are welcome here." Those Sundays became the quiet architecture of my healing. Richard taught me chess and pretended not to mind when I lost spectacularly every time. Eleanor showed me how to make pie crust from memory, refusing to write the recipe down because, in her words, some things should live in your hands, not on paper. Daniel's children began calling me Aunt Tori without consulting anyone. Marcus and I developed an easy rhythm, conversations that stretched late into the night, shared glances across the table, an unspoken understanding that neither of us needed to rush anything. And my biological family? They disappeared. No calls. No texts. No holidays acknowledged. Not even the performative kindness of a birthday card. For the first time in my life, I stopped noticing. Because for the first time, love was not conditional on my silence. One afternoon in early spring, Eleanor and I sat on her back porch with cups of tea, watching tulips push stubbornly through the soil. "Have you heard from your parents?" she asked, her tone neutral, informational. I shook my head. "No. And I haven't reached out either." She nodded. "Do you want to?" I considered it honestly, sometimes. Late at night. But then I remember there's nothing to explain. They understood perfectly. They just didn't care. "That's often the hardest truth," Eleanor said. "Not misunderstanding, indifference." She took a sip of her tea, then added, almost casually, "You know, in my years practicing family law, I learned something interesting. The law is often more emotionally honest than people are." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "It recognizes families people build," she said. "Not just the ones they're born into." The words settled quietly, like seeds. 2 years passed before they bloomed. Marcus and I never had a dramatic beginning. We simply became something more, one unremarkable choice at a time. He chose to show up. He chose consistency. He chose me without demanding that I shrink to earn it. He proposed at Harborview Grill, the same restaurant where Eleanor had first noticed me crying into my napkin. When he knelt and asked me to marry him, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering, I said yes without fear. Wedding planning was joyful and exhausting and unfamiliar in the best way. There were flowers and venues and dress fittings. There was laughter and planning and anticipation. And then there was the invitation. One line. "Parents of the bride." I stared at the draft on my laptop, my chest tightening. I could not print names that had erased me. I could not grant them a role they had forfeited. That night, Eleanor found me pacing the living room. "Tell me," she said. I did. She listened without interrupting, then said gently, "There is something we can talk about, if you're ready." I was. Adult adoption. The word sounded strange at first, formal, almost clinical. But as Eleanor explained it, the legal recognition, the permanence, the clarity, I felt something inside me steady. Richard didn't hesitate when she asked him. "We've considered her our daughter for years," he said simply. The process took months, paperwork, hearings, signatures. When the judge signed the final order, I was no longer Tory Thatcher. I was Tory Morrison. Legally, publicly, irrevocably. 3 months before the wedding, my biological mother began calling. 5 missed calls in one day. A text followed. "Why didn't you tell us? We're your family." I deleted it. Victoria texted a week later. "Did you know Tori's getting married?" I blocked her. They remembered I existed only when my absence became inconvenient. The wedding day arrived bathed in soft light. I stood at the altar calm, composed, surrounded by people who had chosen me. When the officiant reached the line, his voice clear and unhurried. "And who gives this woman in marriage?" He looked directly at Richard and Eleanor. The room shifted. "Her parents," he said, smiling. "Richard and Eleanor Morrison." I did not look back. I did not need to. There are moments when a life pivots so quietly that only the people who have lived through its fractures recognize the sound. No thunder. No applause. Just a subtle redistribution of gravity. The announcement had done that. I felt it in the way the room breathed afterward, an almost imperceptible pause, like the collective mind of the audience recalibrating. There were no gasps. No murmurs loud enough to be rude. Only the faint awareness that something permanent had just been clarified. I stood very still at the altar, my hands folded, my spine straight, my heart remarkably calm. I did not look back at my biological family. I did not need to witness their reaction to know it was unraveling. When the ceremony ended and the music began, the guests rose in a soft, coordinated motion. Richard kissed my cheek with paternal pride. Eleanor held my hands and looked at me the way she always did, steady, present, unapologetically on my side. Marcus smiled at me like the world had finally aligned with something he'd known all along. At the reception, the atmosphere remained celebratory, but something else threaded through it, recognition. People understand hierarchy instinctively. They read cues. They observe who is centered, who is deferred to, who is protected. My parents, my former parents, stood near the edge of the room like guests who had arrived at the wrong event. My mother approached first. She waited until Eleanor was momentarily occupied, until Marcus was pulled into a conversation across the room. Her timing had always been strategic. She stepped into my line of sight with a brittle smile that did not reach her eyes. "Tori," she said, as if we had spoken yesterday. I turned to face her fully. I did not lean in. I did not soften. "Linda," I replied. Her lips tightened, just slightly. I had never called her by her first name before. "We need to talk," she said. I considered her words. The presumption inside them. The assumption that proximity still equaled access. "No," I said calmly. "We don't." Her expression flickered, confusion first, then irritation, then the faintest edge of panic. This is highly inappropriate," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do this publicly." I tilted my head, studying her the way one studies an unfamiliar artifact. "I didn't do anything publicly. I told the truth. The law did the rest." My father hovered a few steps behind her, hands clasped, eyes darting between us like a man waiting for instructions. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again. Victoria arrived moments later, breathless, indignation sharpened into something theatrical. "So that's it?" she demanded. "You replace us? You just erase us?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and felt nothing that required suppression. "You were never erased," I said. "You were prioritized, repeatedly. This is simply the outcome of that allocation." Her mouth opened, then closed. She had never been challenged without the immediate reinforcement of our parents' approval. "You're being cruel," my mother said, her voice trembling now. "After everything we've done for you." I smiled then, not out of spite, but clarity. "You didn't do anything for me," I said. "You did things instead of me. You chose comfort over responsibility, silence over protection, and peace over truth." My father finally spoke. "Tori, sweetheart." I raised my hand gently. "Please don't." He stopped. There are boundaries that do not need reinforcement once they are stated with finality. I turned away from them then, not abruptly, not dramatically. Simply turned, rejoining the life that had already moved on without them. That was the moment they lost everything that mattered. Not their reputation. Not their standing. But relevance. They lingered for a while, long enough to be noticed as out of place, then left quietly, unnoticed in the way people leave when the room has already decided they no longer belong to the story. I did not watch them go. Later that evening, as the reception softened into conversation and laughter, Eleanor found me near the edge of the dance floor. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "Better than okay." She squeezed my hand. "You handled that with grace." "It wasn't grace," I said. "It was clarity." That night, as Marcus and I drove away from the venue, the city lights blurring past the windows, I felt no rush of triumph. No urge to recount the confrontation. No need for vindictive satisfaction. Just peace. The kind that comes when a pattern finally breaks. In the months that followed, there were no more attempts at contact. No apologies. No reckoning. My biological family returned to their familiar arrangement, one less chair at the table, insisting to anyone who would listen that they had been wronged, that they didn't understand what happened. They never would. I took Eleanor's last name legally, socially, without hesitation. I built a life that did not require my absence to function. I surrounded myself with people who did not confuse love with obedience. And sometimes, on Sundays, when we all sit around the Morrison table, full plates, overlapping conversations, children interrupting without consequence, I catch myself observing the scene with quiet awe. Not because it is extraordinary, but because it is earned. I was not dramatic. I was not difficult. I was not too much. I was simply born into a family that needed a scapegoat to preserve its illusion of peace. And when I stepped out of that role, I did not destroy them. I simply stopped holding them together. That was never my job. And this life, this table, this name, is what happens when you finally choose yourself without apology.